What I would like to do this morning is start with prayer. I know we already did morning prayer and we had a hymn this morning, but I want to start with a prayer by Flannery O'Connor. Flannery wrote these prayers when she was about 21 years old at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and she was raised Catholic and was suddenly finding herself not understanding her prayers and wanting to find new ones and wanting to try to write her own. For a year or two, she did this, and she tried to write these prayers that grew out of the things she was reading and thinking about. And so the prayers, I think, are really insightful, not only for those of us who can then attend to the things around us and draw up our own prayers, but I also think that it's another quote-unquote saint, not canonical saint, that we can model, we can imitate her in the way that she prays. So I want to start with her prayer this morning. What I am asking for is really very ridiculous. Lord, I am saying at present, I am a cheese. Make me a mystic immediately. But then God can do that, make a mystic out of cheeses. But why should he do it for an ingrate, slothful, and dirty creature like me? But I would like to be a mystic and immediately. But dear God, please give me some place, no matter how small. But let me know it and keep it. If I am the one to wash the second step every day, let me know it and let me wash it, and let my heart overflow with love washing it. Take my soul, dear God, because it knows that you are all it should want. And if it were wise, you would be all it would want. And the times it thinks wise, you are all it does want. And it wants more and more to want you. Its demands are absurd. It's a moth who would be king, a stupid, slothful thing, a foolish thing, who wants God, who made the earth, to be its lover immediately. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, thank you for joining me in that prayer. I think this is what we're doing with our lives. I think we are all doing something absurd and outrageous with our lives. We are trying to make cheeses into mystics in our classrooms. Doesn't that feel like what we're doing? I mean, why else would you fly across the country or drive in to be in a ballroom in Charleston to learn more about how to do this better if it wasn't such a divine calling? Why else would you spend your time this way? Because what we're doing is not merely making productive citizens, right? If education was just about making productive citizens, would you be spending 3 days away from your family to pour yourself into this? No, you are liberators. You are revolutionaries for the kingdom. You are cultivating saints in your classrooms. And that kind of calling is demanding something of you. And you want to know how to do it better, and you want to be able to guide these students to love the Lord the way that you hope you love the Lord, to want him more the way Flannery expresses that she wants him more. So what does it mean to be a saint? Why is this the call that we have, and why are we supposed to cultivate saints in our classroom? I'm going to turn to Matthew 13:16 for the starting text this morning. And I'm using the Message translation. I'm on a Eugene Peterson kick. I may quote him half a dozen times. When I'm in the middle of reading somebody, they start coming out and everything else that I'm doing. And so I'm on a kick right now where I'm just reading everything that Eugene Peterson did. And I love the Message. I love that he tries to take this language of Koine Greek, right, the commonplace Greek, and make it commonplace American. And for me, it defamiliarizes these verses that I've memorized in the New International Version by heart. And I get to hear them again with new ears and new eyes. And that's part of what I want to talk about this morning is in order to cultivate saints, in order even for ourselves to pursue this call to sanctity, we have to have the ears and eyes of saints. In Matthew 13, Jesus has given the parable of the different seeds landing on different pieces of soil. And I want to focus on his disciples' response to that. The disciples came up, this is Matthew 13:10. The disciples came up and asked, "Why do you tell stories?" He replied, "You've been given insight into God's kingdom. You know how it works. Not everybody has this gift, this insight. It hasn't been given to them. Whenever someone has a ready heart for this, the insights and understandings flow freely. But if there is no readiness, any trace of receptivity soon disappears." That's why I tell stories. To create readiness. To nudge the people toward a welcome awakening. In the present state, they can stare till doomsday and not see it. Listen till they're blue in the face and not get it. I don't want Isaiah's forecast repeated again. And this is from Isaiah. Your ears are open, but you don't hear a thing. Your eyes are awake, but you don't see a thing. People stick their finger in their ears so they won't have to listen, and they screw their eyes shut so they won't have to look, so they won't have to deal with me face to face and let me heal them. But you have God-blessed eyes, eyes that see, and God-blessed ears, ears that hear. So here we have some definition for what it means to be a saint, to have eyes and ears that are set apart from everyone else, eyes that can see and ears that can hear. And how do we train our students then to have these same eyes that aren't blind by the world and ears that aren't deaf to what's around them? It takes a lot of learning to see things with a saint's eye, Graham Greene writes. And I think our call is to offer that kind of learning. Now, I don't need to go into the problems with modern education. I think most of you are aware of the problems with modern education. But just to give one example of where we see this, Anna Julia Cooper in the 1930s wrote this amazing essay called On Education. And if you're interested in what I say about Cooper, Angel Adams Parham is actually speaking on Cooper in a breakout session later today, so you can dig into that more. But Cooper saw the problem as we're not actually creating great eyes and ears in our students. We're just turning them all into hands. We're reducing them all just to hands. She says, our goal as educators is to make students righteous. What we see instead is that people around us are trying to turn them into machines, into computers, into jobs. Cooper insisted, in a word, we are supposed to be building human beings, not chemists, not just farmers, not just cooks or soldiers, but people who are ready to serve the body politic in whatever avocation their talent is needed. She fights against this reductionist impulse to over-specialize our students too young, to teach then only what is useful to them. Aren't you tired of hearing that question? What use is this to me? And I think that the same complaint she's responding to, which is, what good is the education, remember this is 1930, what good is the education for the Negro, this reduction view of a person? And we're doing the same thing a century later. What good is education for the future nurse? What good is a liberal arts education for the future doctor? What good is for future education for a mother who decides to stay home? We've reduced people to what their work is going to be. The aim for education, Cooper says, though, is for the human soul to be trained aright, to give power and right direction to the intellect, the sensibilities, and the will. The human soul. If we are in the ministry of educating souls, how different will our practices look to the way the world trains educators and students? Now think about this for a second. If you look at Christian colleges, there should be a huge difference between education departments at Christian colleges and secular colleges should be. There is not. The research has been done on this. There's not any difference between the way that Christian colleges are doing education and secular colleges. At most, you're going to get a Bible verse or a prayer read at the beginning of the day, or you're going to hear, like every other job, to be a Christian in your workplace. But our job is radically different because our telos is radically different. You're not going to have the same means of cultivating saints as you are if you're trying to create productive citizens for the workforce. It's going to be completely different. So I want to look at that today. As Peterson, I told you I'm going to quote him a lot, he thought the goal would be contemplation. That would be our telos. What is contemplation? We throw that word around all the time. If we're going to cultivate these saints who contemplate, that their lives are for contemplation, what is it? He says that it's about submitting to biblical revelation, taking it in within ourselves, and living it unpretentiously and without fanfare. That's his definition. Contemplation means living what we read, not wasting any of it or hoarding it up, but living it. That's a great definition of contemplation. Peterson then steps in, I think, to a long line in Western tradition that prioritized contemplation this way. If you've read the 1988 Only the Lover Sings, Joseph Pieper, they have some Pieper over there on 8th Day, so yeah, I'm going to do that a few times. Pieper actually draws this quote from Anaxagoras, who precedes Plato, I think, by like a century, in which Anaxagoras says, "Why are we here on earth?" And then answers his own question, to behold. Later, when this is translated from Greek into Roman, it's, why are we here on earth? To contemplate, right? What is this contemplation? Pieper defines it as being opened up by love alone. That it's, as I think it was John said yesterday in our session on contemplation, contemplation is loving vision. It's the eyes that see lovingly. It's the ears that hear with love. It's the saints' eyes and saints' ears. For me, this occurs in novels and poetry. When Christ in Peterson's version in Matthew says, "Why do you tell stories?" I love that as a story teacher. It feels like someone's actually apologizing for what I do for me, and I didn't have to do it. Instead, Christ says, "Why do I tell stories? To nudge people awake." Now, why does that work that way? So C.S. Lewis used to correspond, to answer his letters all the time, and one of the nuns he corresponded with said, how do I become a better person? He sent her George MacDonald's novels. Of course he did. And the reason why he defends in the letter, he says, I'm sending you a novel because when it comes to understanding what is wrong with us, it's easy to look in a mirror. But when we're trying to understand how to be better, we need to look at somebody else who's done it. We have to look at these fictional saints, or we have to look at the real saints. We have to see people who we can model. And the great thing about novels, especially when it's about holy characters, is for a brief moment when you're in their eyes and in their perspective, you get to feel what that's like, right? To see that way, and to hear that way. Lewis writes in Experiment in Criticism, in great literature I see with 1,000 eyes, right? And yet it is I who see, like the night sky. Oh, I messed that up. In great literature I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in a Greek poem I see with myriad eyes. Yet it is still I who see, right? So you get to practice this other way of seeing the world that is really important. So I draw on fiction, on poetry to give us these eyes to be able to see things and hear things differently. We've mentioned the Ransom trilogy a few times. I think Andrew last night said Mark Studdock. If you haven't read the Ransom trilogy, C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength is essentially his novel about what is wrong with education and how things could be made right. So he wrote those radio talks, The Abolition of Man, right, in 1941. They're published, I think, in 1943. And then the novel that he writes is essentially living out. It's an embodiment of everything he says didactically in Abolition of Man. What I want to look at is a very early portion in That Hideous Strength. So if you haven't read the novel, you won't feel like you're missing anything. But early on in the novel, and he sets it at a college, and he says, this is based on no college, but just many colleges I know. right? But it's Bracton College. He makes it up, and they're having a faculty meeting. And the narrator, for all intents and purposes, is Lewis himself. And at this faculty meeting, I think we see a contrast between the way that these educators have reduced reality and are not seeing with saints' eyes, in contrast to the way that narrator sees. The college owns a wood. It's called Bragdon Wood. And they're trying to decide whether to sell it. So what they do is the bursar holds up a map. And he says, the task at hand is to decide whether to sell the area colored pink, which with the warden's permission, I will now pass around the table. We have taken a wood and we have subtracted its smells, its tastes, its feeling, its reality to this pink area on the map. And I'm going to pass it around so you can study it at a distance safely, right? There's a complete reductionist view that takes place here for what the wood is, right? It's what Donald Cowan would call the myth of fact, where the fact becomes the whole reality. But what are we missing when we see that way? Instead, right before this moment, readers have seen a new way or a better way of encountering the wood. The narrator walks through. He describes a high wall that encloses it. He says, when you enter, you sense a gradual penetration into a holy of holies. The narrator then invites the reader to join him on this expedition. He says, first you. He puts you in the place of this adventure. First you went through the Newton quadrangle, which is dry and gravelly, florid but beautiful Gregorian buildings look down upon it. Next, you must enter a cool tunnel-like passage, nearly dark at midday, that bears a whiff of fresh bread. The grass here looks very green after the aridity of Newton, and the very stone of the buttresses that rise from it gives the impression of being soft and alive. Chapel's not far off. The hoarse, heavy noise of the works of a great and old clock comes to you somewhere overhead. You are in a sweet Protestant world. You found yourself perhaps thinking of Bunyan or Walton's Lives. As I went over the quiet turf, I had the sense of being received. The trees were just so wide apart that one saw uninterrupted foliage in the distance. But the place where one stood seemed always to be in a clearing. Surrounded by a world of shadows, one walked in the middle of sunshine. It's a beautiful contrast. You have the smell of bread. You have the sound of the bells of the old clock. You have connotations, memories of things you've read, Bunyan and Walton's Lives. There's all these layers to the reality around you. When you look and see, you don't reduce things to its particles, to a place on a map. You experience all of it. That's contemplation. That's the saint's eyes that I think we're trying to get to. And who, after seeing both of those, would not want Lewis's vision of the world? Everything in our experience, I think, is heightened by that description. We're evoked. The beauty evokes our souls. That's what contemplation is. Now, that's how to see with the saint's eyes. And Pieper mostly focuses on that, but he also talks about the aural way of hearing, contemplating through your ears. Pieper says that we want to keep the visual noise of daily inanities at a distance, and then he addresses the chaos of sound, the pandemonium. Now, he's writing this in 1988. Whenever I hear people sound like they're describing my time in 1988, suddenly I'm like, okay, you're on to something universal here. Because he says, aren't we surrounded, 1988, aren't we surrounded by noise? wow, 2021, aren't we just surrounded by noise? I keep quoting Eliot, distracted from distraction by distraction. Pieper says, the question that must come to us is how can we be saved from becoming a totally passive consumer of mass-produced goods and a subservient follower beholden to every slogan the managers may proclaim? How can we preserve and safeguard the foundation of our spiritual dimension and an uncorrupted relationship to reality with all this noise? How could we possibly see or hear things, which he says is the goal of education, to grasp the totality of things? He then includes a discussion of the oral training, and he draws from Lewis. He says, Lewis mentions that in hell, the only thing missing is music and silence. You may assume that what would be missing in hell would be silence. Just music, but you would have only silence. But the reality is that you have unordered noise in hell. Silence is still beautiful. There's an order. Silence then makes us aware for the music. It prepares for the music. I saw this play years ago about Orpheus as he ventures into hell. The entire time you're watching this play, there's a drip that you don't know where it's coming from. And that was hell. And you're supposed to experience that. I mean, how many of us have experienced that? You're like, where is that coming from? Like, I'm going to stop. That noise that seems to have no purpose and no end and no source and no order to it. That's hell. That kind of noise is around you all the time. And instead, you're supposed to be attuning yourself to the music of the spheres. Pythagoras thought that the sun, earth, and moon and all the other planets actually emitted their own hums, right? And then, of course, Kepler in The Harmony of the World, he argued that this inaudible music could be perceived by the soul and then imitated in human music. And Pieper describes this music as capable of forming us into contemplatives. If we listen to the kind of music that's trying to imitate the music of the spheres. In the existential depth of the listener, Pieper writes, far below the level of judgment, there echoes in identical immediacy the same vibration that is articulated in audible music. Our souls then are desiring to sing the song creation sings. And there's certain noise that we attune ourselves to that forms us to hear that song better. Anybody who's Tolkien and Lewis fans know that this, of course, is how they created their worlds. They founded their worlds with the idea that they were sung into being. And then it is our job as saints to attune ourselves to that song. So if you read Tolkien's Silmarillion, right, where the god actually creates the angelic beings who sing his thoughts into existence. The voices of these angels, like unto harps and lutes and pipes and instruments and viols and organs, and like unto countless choirs singing with words, began to fashion the theme of God to a great music. And a sound arose of endless interchanging melodies woven in harmony that passed beyond hearing into the depths and into the heights, and the places of the dwelling of God were filled to overflowing, and the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. Although there are various singers in this, the voices weave together to become one. The songs are endless, but they're connected. They're countless, much like the infinite variety, I think, of good things we see in creation, but they're fashioned with purpose, much like this song. And Tolkien then, of course, is highlighting the creativity of our Creator. He fills this world to overflowing. The gratuitousness of God's grace that is to be found around us. Of course, Tolkien and Lewis influenced each other. There's also Bandersnatch over at Eighth Day if you want to read about Tolkien and Lewis and their influence on one another. But in The Magician's Nephew, when Lewis then creates his world, he does something very similar. I know many of you know this. I'm not even going to set up the scene, but I am going to read parts of it because it's beautiful. A voice had begun to sing. What begins as one voice becomes many more than you could possibly count. You hear all the overlap. They were in harmony with it, but far higher up the scale, cold, tingling, silvery voices, accompanied simultaneously by the creation of stars. And there are human observers there, and they feel certain it was the stars themselves that were singing. In response to this song, Cavi from London exclaims, "Glory be. I'd have been a far better man all my life if I'd known things were like this." And of course, that's the irony, is that things are like this. So we as readers get to hear our world. Yes, it's Narnia. Yes, it's Middle Earth. But it is also being sung about our world. So we can return to this reality after seeing these depictions of it and hearing these songs, and then listen for where those songs might actually be heard in our world. This, of course, is why we're supposed to be doing this with our students, giving them rhythm and meter to their day through liturgy, through song, giving them the things that they can expect that make them feel comfortable, and then defamiliarizing those expectations and lifting them a little bit higher. In reality, it's always like Dante's journey. It feels cyclical, that we're doing the same thing every day, every year, and yet we're getting higher and higher as we go. The cycle is more like a spiral than just cyclical. If contemplation is the highest, yesterday we were talking about how do you get there? How do you get to what's the highest thing if we're here now? And so we got to talk yesterday in our breakout session about a few of the ways that this would look like. There's a Carthusian monk named Guido II, so the second guy, essentially. And this is the anonymity of the saints all the time, right? And he describes 3 different preceding rungs to contemplatio. And I think these 3 can be very helpful in looking at how to guide our students towards contemplation. And forgive me for those 30-something people that were there yesterday, because it'll be repetitive. But any classical educator knows repetition is great for actually learning this. And so we'll go back through some of the things we did yesterday. But for those of you this is new, you're welcome at the end to also ask some more questions, because I'm going to go through some of these. Lectio, meditatio, oratio, contemplatio, right? So lectio, reading, meditation, prayer, contemplation. Those are the 4 rungs that we go through. So lectio only means reading, right? Reading the word. When it comes to science, it means reading reality. Reading the things that you actually see that are there in front of you. It always sounds obvious, and yet I feel like this is the step that people miss the most. Flannery O'Connor said, "Why do people assume if they can read a phone book, they can read a short story?" It's not true. And Peterson says about Scripture, it is not sufficient to place a Bible in someone's hands and then say, read it. It's quite as foolish as putting the keys to a Honda in someone's hands and say, drive it. And just as dangerous if they don't know how to drive, right? The same problem with reading. We actually have to teach people how to read. Even more so now, when people have become accustomed to reading online, reading in flashes, reading with it is really training their minds to read in blips and instances, right? To see what they want to see and hear what they want to hear, to hear only what is comfortable to them, to see only what is comfortable to them, and they have no idea how to read hard things, right? We don't. We're losing our ability all the time to read things that are challenging, that wouldn't have been challenging to other people 100 years ago. How much is going to be lost if we don't pay attention to just reading exactly what is on the page? not to mention ever getting to contemplation, but just reading the words that are there. One of the reasons, again, that I love Peterson's translation is he spent 10 years going through the Hebrew, going through the Greek, going through Latin translations, going through other people's translations, going through poetic renderings of the Psalms, just investing himself in the words that were on the page and what they actually meant. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to have a certain care with words, and we have to pay attention to them. I think we need to slow down. I think we need to taste language. I think we need to define what we mean and not use words so easily and thus so dangerously. Even when we speak. I think someone here I met in the hallway said, "Oh, you have a degree in literature. You people make me uncomfortable." Right? Because we're thinking about what you're saying, we're thinking about what we say. But I think all Christians have that same call, that we're so attentive to the words, we don't let people just say them. To not say what you mean, right? It's so important to actually say what you mean and to demand that of our students and to actually demand that of the work in front of us. At this point, let me move over to meditation. This word probably makes some people uncomfortable because it sounds a lot like the trendy, like mindfulness, or you imagine like the yogi on the carpet. That's not actually what meditation would mean in this context. Think more what Aquinas says, that divine wisdom is at play in the world. Meditation is about imagination and play. We should then play with the words in front of us. It's so much fun to do this with poetry. You put a poem on the board, and then there's a free-for-all. I'm going to erase 5 or 6 of the words, replace them with words that sound like them. You don't even have to know what they mean. What do these words sound like to you? And what does that do to someone? Because words have intrinsically in them certain sounds, certain feelings that we've become accustomed to because we've been trained to use words this way. The word sorrow, right, sounds like borrow. Why does one of them make us sad and the other one makes us feel hopefully nothing? I don't know if you have bad experiences with borrowing, but one has some emotional weight to it and the other doesn't, but they sound so similar? Why? There's nothing really sad about the letter S. Play with words. You'll get somewhere so surprising when you just start meditating on the choices of the words, or then do synonyms, right? Then what happens if you're trying to write a poem and someone used the word sorrow and you replace it with sad? Right? At least sorrow. You can say that with some gravitas. Sad, you can't ever say it with gravitas. And the more that you try, it still defeats the purpose, right? You can't do it. You're gonna all walk out of here and be like, sad. You're gonna try it. But it is very difficult to do. And this is the part I think your students will start enjoying. They'll pay so much attention to the words, and they don't even know they're doing something profound. But they are, when they start meditating on the words and the language. Attention really prepares the soul for prayer. The easy way to talk about prayer when it comes to in the classroom is starting the day with prayer, which I do believe is important. I start my talks normally with a prayer. I do believe that's important, to always be remembering what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, returning this gift of time and energy back to the one who gives us the very gifts to do this. So I do believe in that sort of prayer, but I want to talk about prayer on another level first. When I'm talking about meditation and that you're making students attend to things, attention, I'm going to draw this book. I also asked Josh if I could borrow this from 8th Day. So this is available over there. If you don't have this book, you need to go get this book. And there's only one copy, so have fun. This is called Waiting for God by Simone Weil. And Simone Weil wrote this great essay with a very unwieldy title, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with Attention Toward Loving God. Yay! It's a very unwieldy title. She actually just wrote it originally as a letter, so she didn't intend to title it, and so it gets this crazy title. But the essay is actually really good and not as difficult to understand as the title. Attention, she says, is like kenosis. In the same way that we see in Philippians that the Lord not thinking equality with God is something to be grasped, but lowered himself, right? That lowering, that emptying of oneself, that model of humility is what Simone Weil says is attention. How many of you, when talking to somebody, they look away, they look for someone else that might be in the room, they're thinking about the next thing that they have to do or the next thing that they have to go to, their phone goes off, which is now on your watches, which is awesome, because it means every time you're talking to someone, they're like, oh, that's not as important as you. Oh, it could be, it's not as important as you, right? The level of attention that we completely lack, right? And Simone Weil, she's writing this in 1941, but she's saying we need to empty ourselves and attend to the person in front of us, to the math problem in front of us, to the science question in front of us, to the word in the poem. That attention to school studies is not merely about receiving grades. And I think she goes even farther than that, because I've had students argue this with me. And so I'm going to read this passage. And so imagine yourself in the place of a student for a second hearing this. And I teach this usually to first-year students every single year. Students must therefore work without any wish to gain good marks. Okay, you're a student, just be thinking through that. Students must therefore work without any wish to gain good marks, to pass exams, to win school success, without any reference to their natural abilities and tastes, right? I'm not good at science. I'm not good at math. I'm better at this. Applying themselves equally to all tasks with the idea that each one will help to form them in the habit of attention, which is the substance of prayer. By giving themselves without reference to success, without reference to a grade, without reference to their own talents and abilities, they will then dedicate themselves instead to the attention, which is the substance of prayer. That's the goal for prayer. So when we look at lectio, meditatio, oratio, that's what is being talked about here. Training yourself to be so completely empty, you're able to receive. Right? And students need this level of attention, and their school studies can actually be a way of gaining this level of attention, of practicing this in the world. I think that this is the way we should pray in our classes, so that every activity in our class does not become a mere activity in our class, but can be an act of love in our class. And I think that's the difference, is that level of attention. Now, before I gave this talk, you may have assumed that contemplation was, this isolated activity. You have to go off by yourself, be still, be silent, and that's contemplation. You're all alone, solitude. Anybody who reads the early Desert Fathers knows that the first thing they discover when they go out into the desert by themselves is actually the noises get louder when they're all alone. So the noise is it's impossible to completely get rid of. You have to train against it, but it's there whether you're alone praying in your closet or whether you're constantly going about your day because you don't have the time to sit and pray in your closet. The rest of the day is going to come back to you the minute you open the closet door anyways. So contemplation needs to be about more than just that inner solitude, those moments of quiet. And actually, we were talking yesterday, because we had a mother in our room. Dorothy Day reflects on motherhood as actually preparing us for the mystic life, because it's a sanctification that you didn't choose. And so it's actually, you're constantly having to give up, right? To empty yourself of the things you want to do during that time, of maybe even getting to eat during that time because somebody else has to eat during that time. And so there's a constant kenosis that's happening that's demanding things of you. And if you're giving that level of attention, you're preparing your heart for prayer and contemplation. So the contemplation that can happen in the quotidian, Kathleen Norris writes, is not like those who contemplate holiness in isolation, where they reach the godlike illumination in this serene silence. But the quotidian mystics are those who manage to find God in a life filled with noise, the demands of other people, and relentless daily activities that would consume the self. And in the midst of this, can we be contemplatives? We also talked yesterday about what the contemplation looks like in relation to the active life. Too much in our own lives, I think we separate those into two different worlds. You have those who are the actors, right? This is the Martha Mary, the misreading reductionist reading of Martha and Mary. Martha does things and Mary sits. But in reality, the latter is about ascending and descending all the time. You don't just contemplate and then stay there unless you're dead. You contemplate and then you return to action again. And the contemplation informs the action so that it's right action. And if you're not contemplative, you act, and the actions of selflessness, of self-giving, move you toward contemplation. We said yesterday as well, Gerard Manley Hopkins, when someone was struggling with their faith, said, he advised them, what should they do? They should give alms. They should start practicing these things outward, and that practice will also move them toward contemplation. I think it'll keep them from this life of activity that we constantly strive for. I have students who will come in first-year seminar, and they're new freshmen. They have their calendars filled. I mean, they've written all different colors sometimes. This is what I'm going to be doing. And you have to ask them, what is your life if you can't do any of that? I mean, I think most of us discovered that last year with quarantine. Like, what is suddenly my life without all that activity? Who am I still? And that's what you take into your day. And that also, I think, gives you the perspective to say which of those things are really worth doing or not, and how you do them and how you're motivated to do them. I think contemplation reminds us of the givenness of our days, givenness of the things that are at hand. It reminds us that we can't fix all the problems that are around us, that we can't even fix our students. They're cheeses. Right? That we're trying to make into mystics, but we can't actually change who they are. We can't force them to love the things that we love. We can't force them to do their homework. We can't force them to read things. And so instead, contemplation reminds us of leaving it open, letting God work, because it's all His from beginning to end. The children who have been given to us as parents or as students, they belong to Him. And we can only lead Him there. It's this paradox of striving for sanctity ourselves and knowing the sanctity only comes from Him. George Herbert wrote this great poem called The Windows, in which he really deals with this paradox. He says, Lord, how can man preach the eternal word? How can a human being preach the eternal word? For he's nothing but crazy, and that meant broken, right? Crazy, crazed, broken. He's nothing but crazy glass. Yet in thy temple thou dost him afford to be a window through thy grace. Broken glass, but when God's light shines through it, it's the stained glass windows. And that's why churches aren't filled with mirrors. They're filled with stained glass to remind us it's His light through our brokenness that shines forth. Let me conclude by reading a poem by Denise Levertov. And then if you have questions, I think we'll have 5 minutes to take them. But I'll finish with a poem. Listen, meditate. May this moment of attention become prayer for you and lead you toward greater contemplation. Let's go. Much as the dog goes intently hazard, the Mexican light on a day that smells like autumn in Connecticut, makes iris ripples on his black gleaming fur, and that too is as one would desire, a radiance consorting with the dance. Under his feet, rock and mud, his imagination sniffing, engaged in its perceptions, dancing edgeways. There's nothing the dog disdains on his way. Nevertheless, he keeps moving, changing pace and approach, but not direction. Every step an arrival. Thank you. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. I got the thumbs up, so. Yes?
I probably lost my attention. So I might be confused with probably because of the previous definitions in my mind of meditation and contemplation. So I think I got a lot of meditation. Can you give me just a little bit more about contemplation?
Sure. So contemplation, I mean, you can equate those with rest, with leisure, with loving vision. It's the end goal in which, think about how the saints see compared to the way we see the world. So if there's, for example, my children, mom, I hear or see that as like, what do you need? Why do you say my name like it's your favorite word, right? That's not a saint's loving attention. And so contemplation is being able to be in those moments and hear and see that the way a saint would. And you prepare for that through reading the word, meditating, playing with it, because you don't want to just read. That's the first step, and that's very important. But you read, you meditate on it, you pray it, and then hopefully that process has led you to contemplating the God who is the Word. Yeah.
It's like you're learning the math lesson, and it's really hard, and then once you get it,
Yeah.
now you get to rest in it.
Yes, absolutely. She said it's like with the math problem. First, read the math problem, you think through it, you try to do it, and once you get it, eventually it gets to be like, you could not get that wrong. When you get to the point with the math problems that you could not get that wrong, that's a resting in the math problem. And then, of course, you can go on to the next things. And that's why I also meant about Dante's spiral. Like, you get somewhere, but when it comes to the journey of the pilgrim on earth, like, you're always getting somewhere, returning back to that place and getting somewhere, but it's not cyclical the way the Greeks would consider it. And it's not merely linear, it's ascendant in its cyclicalness. It's more of a spiral way of looking at it. So, yes?
It's not exactly a question, but it's invitation. The way you talk especially about attention,
Uh-huh.
attention received on vetting, is very similar to the ways that I've been talking about wonder lately. Insofar as what's required is an active receptivity. And so you have to work to hold open a space within yourself for the grandeur of the world to come. So I wanted to invite you to bring wonder into this conversation and say something about that in relation to possible.
Yeah, sure. So yesterday, actually, it was brought up. Was Rebecca, I think, that brought up wonder within our conversation. And where does wonder? The question was maybe a question. Where does wonder fit in this? Right. For me, I would start with wonder in meditation. That's where you're questioning. But there has to be this humility in place in order to wonder. Right? Those who know everything, like we talked about yesterday in the Siren song, those who know everything have no space for wonder. Right? They're not open to it. They don't have that humility. Yesterday we were talking about Diary of a Country Priest, because he says, oh, miracle of empty hands, right? That he's able to give this gift that he himself does not possess. And so we talked about if you have your hands open like this receptivity that's available, you are able to receive what's given to you, but also if I've received a gift, you can take it from me because of the posture that I keep. That any gifts I have, you also are able to take and receive. And so it's this constant posture of being open as a giver and receiver in the ways that we respond. So I think that's what wonder does. It keeps you in that constant place of like, whoa, what could I see today? What could I learn today? Right? And I think that that's the posture of wonder. But does it mean we need to go read your book? Yes, okay. Other questions? We have time for one more.
What was the name of the poem you read again?
Denise Levertov, The Overland to the Islands. Again, it was Eugene Peterson's favorite poem, and I'm really obsessed with Peterson right now. His last words, he was in hospice, and all of a sudden he shot up and said, "Let's go," for the start of her poem. So I love that, the way that poetry can then inhabit our souls. That those, don't you want those to be your last words? It's like a poem. You know, you don't want it to be your like shopping list or something to come out. Yes. Yeah.
Other forms of literature. Do you usually practically through how you do that with students?
Yes. So the question was, how do you do these steps with literature? And I tried to draw a little bit of the ways you can do these steps with poetry. The current book I'm writing is actually it's how to read as a Christian. And so it's going through taking these ways that the early patristics, then medievals, that they read scripture pre-Enlightenment. But those are the ways that people based that then to read everything. And what you see is that, as C.S. Lewis would observe, you first begin to read a book that way, but you might find that the author did not deserve that compliment, which I think is very true. But if you're practicing reading in a certain way, you're able then to read well. You're going to filter through the trash. Right? You're going to know when something deserves that level of reading because that person is imitating Christ in how they write and how they read and how they think about things, or whether they're not and they're leading you in a different direction. But it's about the habits and ways of reading that I think we approach this content with. So reading, lectio, meditation on the actual words of the text. And praying, I mean, that's why I ended with Denise Levertov, to pray a poem. Because then when you start seeing just this poem, like, let's go. Yes. I mean, that's the gospel, right? Let's go. So you start reading this and meditating on it, and you find that, like, this is about contemplation. It's concretely, first level, is just about a dog sniffing something. But as you contemplate the dog sniffing something, you realize this is us. What do we smell? What do we see? And we're starting to find the radiance in the dance as we look around us. And thus, every step we take in that direction is an arrival. Every rung of the ladder is an arrival, right? And I think that this poem does that, but only when you have the right eyes to read it that way. And that's what it takes practice, too. Sure, I'll read it one more time, and I'll conclude with that, because I think I want to make sure we stay on schedule. So I'll read the poem one more time, and I guess think of it that way. Think of hearing it this way as a move towards the contemplative life. Let's go. Much as that dog goes intently hazard, the Mexican light on a day that smells like autumn in Connecticut makes iris ripples on his gleaming black fur. And that too, as one would desire, a radiance consorting with the dance. Under his feet, rock and mud, his imagination sniffing, engaged in its perceptions, dancing edgeways. There's nothing the dog disdains on his way. Nevertheless, he keeps moving, changing pace and approach, but not direction. Every step an arrival. Thank you.